So welcome back. We're still in the business of analyzing the choice of market. And in the last video, we've looked at defining the market attractiveness using Porter's 5 forces. And sort of in passing, we also mentioned entry barriers, the potential for entrants to come in. And that's another very important aspect, especially if we're dealing with a firm that looks from the outside into a market. So let me now explain to you what exactly we mean by entry barriers and how we can divide those maybe into different categories. So entry barriers, formally speaking, are factors that allow an incumbent firm to earn positive economic profits while making it unprofitable for newcomers to enter the industry. And we can divide this into structural entry barriers, which are basically about the nature of the industry. They're about the position of the incumbent within the industry. It's not necessarily about the incumbent being special in any way. It's basically about the fact that someone is in the market and someone's outside the market. But there are also strategic entry barriers, and these strategic entry barriers are the result of conscious, specific strategic behavior by an incumbent. This is basically the result of an incumbent's aggressive action with the express intention to keep entrants out of the industry. So let's think about what structural entry barriers are first. One structural entry barrier could be if you have control over essential resources. What exactly does that mean? I guess the most classical way of thinking about this would be if you have access to natural resources that others don't have. De Beers is the dominant player in the world diamond market. And one way of attaining that position was by buying more or less all the supply of many countries, many diamond producing countries. Okay, so De Beers, by buying up the supply, was able to create an essential resource, or to basically get hold and get control over an essential resource. Supplier capacity is another essential resource. So one interesting example here is a small company called Minnetonka. Minnetonka invented liquid soap, right? So the soap that we're using a lot now that has more or less replaced or almost replaced a solid soap in many different settings. So Minnetonka invented liquid soap, but one of the problems was that this is basically a consumer good. This is a cosmetic that has a market structure, or the market has a market structure that's very much dominated by large firms like Unilever, like Procter & Gamble, and so on. So how does a small firm like Minnetonka keep hold of the profits that can be made from an innovation like liquid soap? The way they did it is not by trying to protect liquid soap as such. They knew they wouldn't be able to do that. But what they found out is that to make a successful product out of liquid soap, you needed small pumps. You needed plastic pumps. And it turned out that at the time of the invention of liquid soap, it basically had hardly any use, right? So there was hardly any other use for small plastic pumps. And so what Minnetonka simply did is they approached the very few firms that were able to produce plastic pumps and simply bought up 2 years' worth of supplies for plastic pumps. And this meant that even though Unilever and Procter & Gamble were able to very quickly replicate what liquid soap was about, Minnetonka had a 2-year lead of launching products on the market for consumers because they were the only ones with pumps. Patents are another essential resource, basically a legally given resource. So Sony and Philips invented the compact disc, and anyone who wanted to produce a CD or wanted to produce a CD player had to ask for permission and had to license the patents from Sony and Philips, which obviously gave Sony and Philips a big advantage over anyone else who wanted to come into the market. Having access or having control over a distribution channel is another important reason for an entry barrier, or is an important factor in creating entry barriers, in having structural entry barriers. So Coca-Cola, for example, signs exclusive contracts with fast food chains. And that means that even if you have a fantastic soft drink, if you have a fantastic product as such, it's going to be difficult to get it to the end consumer because other firms have signed up exclusively to selling Coca-Cola soft drinks. Okay, so that creates a problem for potential entrants because the distribution channel is already occupied, is already taken. Location. Supermarkets will locate in particular malls, in particular shopping malls. They will locate in a particular location. So once they have that top spot, it's going to be very difficult for other supermarkets to enter in a similar geography. So you will see often in a shopping mall of some sort, you will often see just a single supermarket. Why? Because others cannot enter into this shopping mall because it's already taken. The essential resource of an attractive location in a mall is already taken. Finally, timing. Airlines have as one essential resource landing slots, arrival slots at airports. And so this creates a situation where sometimes an airline is bought simply for the fact that they have landing slots at a particular airport. So that recently happened when British Airways bought BMI, a smaller British carrier, from Lufthansa for the main reason that they held landing slots at London's Heathrow Airport, which British Airways wanted to expand their own network of flights. And finally, there can be structural entry barriers in the form of essential resources by governments, government-mandated essential resources. So for example, taxi cabs come only in a limited number. So you have to have a license to operate a taxi cab in most cities. And these may be traded, these may be licensed out, these may be issued, but in any case, you cannot operate a cab legally if you don't have that badge, if you don't have a license. Similar, but at a larger scale, if you think about mobile phone networks. So mobile phone networks are basically operate on a particular spectrum. And that spectrum was given out by governments, and there was a limited number of carriers, of operators that could that could operate in this bandwidth of spectrum. And if you don't have any of this bandwidth, then there's no way you can operate a mobile phone network in this in a particular market. So governments may ration the number of players that can be in a market. Another structural entry barrier are economies of scale and scope and economies of learning. So what do I mean by that? First of all, there might be something like a minimum efficient scale to operate in an industry. So you cannot produce just a few semiconductors. You cannot have a small plant in which you produce semiconductors because that's going to make you much more expensive than other players in the market that produce at what's called the minimum efficient scale. So in other words, to enter a market, you have to reach minimum efficient scale, and if that minimum efficient scale is large, then it's going to make it very difficult for you to enter. Okay, so semiconductors is one example, but any industry in which fixed costs are high and the marginal cost of production is fairly low, we are talking about a large minimum efficient scale compared to the size of the market. And that's going to make it difficult for entrants to come in. There may also be cost advantages on the, for incumbents through having gathered experience or through economies of scope. So in the case of airframe or aircraft production, we have both. So experience simply means that if you've produced a large number of planes already, then producing another one is, relatively speaking, particularly cheap. So this can even be quantified. This has been quantified some time ago. And it says, or it's been found that a doubling in the cumulative quantity produced means a reduction of 20% in the cost of production. So in other words, if you've produced one plane already, then producing the second plane is 20% cheaper than producing the first one. If you've produced 100 planes already, then after producing 200 planes, then the 200th plane is going to cost 20% less to produce than the 100th plane. So that obviously means that if you've built up a large cumulative stock of produced units, it's going to make it very difficult for an entrant to come in because they simply haven't gathered that experience. There's also an advantage if you can reuse parts of a product in many different related products. And that's again something we can see in aircraft production. So, for example, you need engines, you need seats, both in small planes and in large planes, and even in medium-sized planes. So what that means is that there is a cost advantage if a firm produces large, small, and medium planes at the same time, because they can reuse some of the parts, some of the components of a product in differently sized planes, in different but related products. So this is what we call economies of scope. A third structural entry barrier are marketing advantages of incumbents. You may simply be able to build up some sort of brand loyalty by initiating, signing up your customers for frequent flyer programs, frequent loyalty programs, frequent buyer programs, if you wish. This is something that makes it difficult or makes it less attractive for someone to switch to a potential entrant. So someone who comes in would have to come in with a much better product or a much cheaper product to make those people switch. And a very similar mechanism is at play when we talk about switching costs. So mobile telephony, many people sign up for long-term contracts. And that means that for a period of 1 year or 2 years, they're basically bound to one particular carrier. And that creates a disincentive for an entrant, because that entrant knows that if these consumers are attached to an existing carrier, it's simply difficult. It's simply less easy for them to gather consumers, because many existing consumers will be attached through long-term contracts. So to summarize, this was all about structural entry barriers. And we'll now take a next step. As you remember, there are structural and there are strategic entry barriers, and we'll talk about strategic ones in the next video. So stay tuned.